At last, a voice for the people who pay big government's bills, not the people who make big government's bills. You are listening to Speaking of Taxpayers here on Gimme Radio, sponsored by the 362,000-member National Taxpayers Union. I am your host, Pete Sepp.
And I'm Natasha Altamirano.
Welcome to this installment of Speaking of Taxpayers. We have a friendly and familiar voice with us here on this edition of Speaking of Taxpayers in the name of Josh Culling. He never joshes when it comes to important taxpayer issues, and boy, do we have a doozy for you today. California, once again the site of an important tax revolt, just as it was back in 1978 with the passage of Proposition 13, the late great Howard Jarvis's property tax limitation measure. Now, we're talking about taxes of lots of kinds, and just as in 1978, California could be the national trendsetter. What do you think, Josh?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me again. It's always nice to be here. California has been an issue or an area of concern for taxpayer advocates such as myself for a few months now. Basically, they have spent themselves into a massive budget deficit. It plateaued at about $42 billion just a couple months ago. Now, to bridge that gap, the governor and some Republicans in name only in the legislature and a host of Democrats agreed on a massive tax increase coupled with some serious spending cuts. Now, not long after that was passed, they realized it wouldn't finish the job. They needed to extend the tax increases. They needed a host of budget gimmicks to keep the budget balanced, rather than the novel idea of actually cutting spending for a long period of time. So they put a host of measures on the ballot last Tuesday, Propositions 1A through 1F, that were aimed at keeping the budget balanced into the future. And it was a host of tax increases, new borrowing, and actually new spending, surprisingly enough. Very counterintuitive. But they all failed. 1A through 1E, which were the tax and spending and borrowing initiatives, all failed 2-1 at the ballot box. Taxpayers said, enough is enough. We're done prolonging the problem and pushing it on to the next generation. The only measure that actually passed was Proposition 1F, which would have disallowed pay raises for legislators in periods of budget deficit, which it was kind of a toothless and weak measure, but more of a symbolic one, with Californians going to the ballot box and just really demonstrating how fed up they are with politicians in Sacramento.
An interesting development, especially that latter one, even though politicians may say, why should our pay matter? It's just a drop in the bucket in the overall budget. It does have symbolic importance in terms of getting lawmakers to tighten their belts during the deficit situation, but I think it also has the most relevance to taxpayers. Not many people might know, for example, if the state tries to spend, $20 million on a new headquarters for one of its departments. Is that a good price or a bad price? But almost all of them can figure out if a state lawmaker's pay of several tens of thousands, I think it's even over 100,000 in California, is worth it because they can relate to it. They can relate to a salary number of that size as opposed to 20 million or $1 billion or whatever.
Sure. And at the end of the day, what Proposition 1F showed is that people are truly ticked off. And the resounding thumping that 1A through 1E, I'll run down quickly what each of these propositions entailed. 1A would have extended the tax hikes that recently passed for an additional 2 years to the tune of about $16 billion. That's tax hikes on sales, income, and vehicles. They tried to disguise this as a spending cap by creating a rainy day fund, which leads into Proposition 1B, which was tied to the creation of the rainy day fund in 1A, and it would have rated it to the tune of $9.3 billion on new spending towards education. Now, that is really, you have to laugh at that.
How cynical.
And a state in such massive budget trouble is actually asking voters to approve $9.3 billion more money to spend. which is unbelievable. That one would fail 2-1. 1C would have allowed the state to borrow against future lottery earnings. That's $5 billion in new borrowing, which of course has to be repaid in the future. And then 1D and 1E were just restoring rating existing spending programs and putting that money into the general fund to help balance the budget. Just more budget gimmicks that really aren't going to do anything. I mean, at the end of the day, what California needs is a hard spending cap. They need to come to terms with the reality that they spend way too much money. In good times, they spend and spend and spend rather than saving any of that. A hard spending cap controls the growth of state spending, regardless of good times or bad. And, you see a state like Colorado that is a taxpayers' bill of rights. They don't go through these boom and bust cycles that a state like California does because A, they control what they spend, and B, their revenue isn't dependent on highly volatile revenue sources such as a really progressive income tax or, targeted sin taxes and things like that.
The interesting thing I noticed, too, was that these tax increases were pushing certain rates to record levels in California. They were asking, I believe, for a 1 percentage point increase in the sales tax, for example. What folks on Gimme Radio here might not realize is that California not only has a state-level sales tax, but local option sales taxes, too. This increase is pushing the combined rate above 10% in a few communities in the state.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. And what you're seeing is people, how I interpret these ballot results is people love their home state of California, just like, it's sometimes irrational. I'm from Ohio. I love the state of Ohio. There's really no reason to, but you just do. And you want to stay there. You want to be able to stay where you've grown up and where you've raised a family and all these things, but they literally cannot do it anymore. They cannot afford to stay in their home state. So people kind of finally got religion and said, look, we need to be able to afford to stay in this state. If you're going to hike our sales tax above 10% of every purchase that we make, if you're going to raise income taxes across the board, if you're going to make it more expensive to buy a car, we can't do it anymore. So I see Californians pleading with their lawmakers to please give us some tax relief, enact some pro-growth policies in this state, bring some jobs back, because a lot of people don't realize that, with as beautiful a state as California is climate-wise, and, Napa Valley and the San Diego and beaches and the ocean, more people have left the state of California in this country over the past 10 years than any state other than New York, and that's directly tied to their punitive tax policy.
So what are the next steps for the legislature and Governor Schwarzenegger?
Well, they're kind of back to the drawing board. The failure of all these propositions opens up a new $21.3 billion budget deficit. I mean, California taxpayers and lawmakers thought that they had this nipped in the bud when they bridged the $42 billion gap, but it's $21 billion again. It's another massive deficit. So they kind of have to sit down and figure out what's the best way to do it. Their constituents aren't going to accept tax hikes anymore. One option that's been floated is bankruptcy for the state, which is really unprecedented, and we don't really know how that would play out. Another more damaging option, which I think is very realistic, would be a federal bailout of California. It's very telling that Governor Schwarzenegger spent election night last Tuesday in Washington, D.C. He couldn't even stand to be in his state as this kind of, ballot box bludgeoning took place. He was there in meetings with high-level officials. I'm speculating here, but I would imagine he's asking for them to bail out his state. As soon as, the day after the propositions passed, President Obama released $8 billion in funding for California's Medicaid, and Governor Schwarzenegger came out and asked for a federally backed loan of $6 billion to help them with their cash flow problem. No one in their right mind, other than the federal government right now, is going to lend California money. Their bond rating is in the tank. It's akin to me, maxing out all my credit cards and spending my entire checking account and then going to the bank and asking for a credit card. It's not going to happen. With the fiscal shape that California's in right now, really their only recourse in my mind is bankruptcy or federal bailout. And, another bailout of such a massive state government that's quote, too big to fail is going to send all the wrong messages to the legislature that you can spend and spend and spend. You can get these massive deficits. You can tick off your entire constituency, but the federal government will be there to make it all better at the end of the day. It's an incredible moral hazard problem. And, unfortunately, I think that might be the most realistic option.
Yeah, Social Security and Medicare have been described as the fiscal elephants in the room when it comes to the federal government's problems. These out-of-control entitlement programs whose very structure guarantees trillions in liabilities. California has a few of its own elephants. There's the ongoing illegal immigration situation, which does put a strain on California's schools and Medicaid. There was that big issue of whether they would offer undocumented workers, their children, in-state college tuition. There is, of course, the biggest issue, which doesn't receive enough press as opposed to illegal immigration, these pension and health care systems for public employees. The Center for Government Analysis, which is a California-based think tank, put the long-term liabilities of these systems in the tens of billions of dollars. It's as if no matter what they do anywhere else in government, there's almost a built-in multi-billion-dollar deficit every year because of these programs. And until they address that, they're never going to get anywhere.
Absolutely, and they get tons of resistance, obviously, from public employee unions on that. You look at just, with ballot initiatives such as these, you can often just follow the money trail to see, who has the big interest in these issues. And, you look at public employee unions, who are the major proponents of all these measures, the extra $9.3 billion towards education, the tax hikes, and all this. They outspent anyone opposed to the measures 10-1. So, and I've seen that number as high as, $30 million for a special election, which is unbelievable. So you're absolutely right. The problem is that public employee unions in California are so entrenched in the political process that it's very hard to get any traction there.
Fortunately, though, I think the down economy, when so many people in the private sector are suffering pay cuts, layoffs, benefit cuts, they start to resent that there's almost this protected class. I mean, normally in good times, the rhetoric is we can never pay teachers enough. We can never offer a good enough pension to people who put in 20 years in government service and the like. Well, some of those facts are debatable, but now, again, just like with pay raises for legislators, people are starting to take a look at their neighbors who work in government and they're saying, this is crazy. I mean, I did that myself. Here at National Taxpayers Union, we have a bare bones health insurance plan to cover our employees. A friend of ours who works for the school system was complaining that because of budget restrictions, she now has to pay $10 for every prescription she picks up as a copay. Our plan, we have to pay up to $60. And those kinds of comparisons are going to become more and more prevalent, and people are going to say, look, I don't begrudge you folks to earn a living in government, but this is ridiculous. I'm not being able to earn a living because of the taxes I pay.
Sure, and I think that there are two important points on that. One is it's important to properly message that, to show people that in periods where people are not only getting pay freezes, but pay cuts and layoffs in the private sector, and public employees are arguing that they need more money every year. I mean, if we went back 10 years to what they made then, without the 10 years of salary and benefit growth, they want you to believe that everyone was raving lunatics and, walking around with, like a cannibalistic society. I mean, everything was pretty good 10 years ago in California, I think. And capping the growth of spending or even cutting it back to 10 years ago levels isn't going to leave everyone out on the street begging. The second point would be, I think that underscores the need for transparency and accountability in government, because a lot of people don't know what public employees make, what public employee unions, what portion of their dues go towards lobbying, and that's taxpayer money. I think that transparency and accountability really allows people to have be better informed in their arguments in things like this. So I think that's something that we should definitely continue to push for.
Now again, folks, coming back to this situation and the election results, this is not just a California-centric issue here. When California votes like this in such a resounding manner, I think it's a litmus test for the way a lot of other folks in a lot of other places are feeling. And again, just as California proved to be the barometer for property tax limits in the late 70s, it's sponsoring movements in Michigan and Massachusetts and lots of other places, they may very well be the barometer for what's going to happen now when legislatures try to raise taxes severely to close their budget gaps. Granted, many places don't allow initiatives or referendum by citizens, but I still think they're going to get in a lot of political trouble. New York may be next, for example.
Sure. And I would just quickly say that, in my mind, the Tea Party movement now has teeth. I mean, we've seen hundreds of thousands of citizens out demonstrating and holding rallies. Now we've actually seen them go and defeat tax hikes, and that's a total outgrowth of the Tea Party movement, and it's exciting.
Well, Josh, on behalf of all Gimme Radio listeners and NTU's 52,300 members in California, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks for having me.
And in this segment, we'll be discussing cap and trade, referred to some by cap and tax. This is a scheme whereby emissions of carbon dioxide and other pollutants would be limited by the federal government through regulation on an industry-by-industry, company-by-company basis. Those firms or industries who had a limitation on them and could not possibly do business under that limitation would have to trade and purchase emissions credits from industries and firms who have them to spare. Not only are there, of course, political aspects to this, which could make the system very lucrative for some and quite difficult for others, but we also have taxpayer costs involved, which is why we're talking about it in this segment. The House Energy and Commerce Committee has passed cap and trade legislation sponsored by Congressman Waxman and Congressman Markey by a 33-25 vote that occurred just prior to the Memorial Day recess. And when members of Congress come back, it could be a matter of days by the time the House ends up voting on this measure on the floor. This means taxpayers have some great concerns to worry about in the near term.
Cap and trade is essentially a climate change tax. President Obama estimates that his bill will raise $645 billion in revenue over 8 years, starting in 2012. But some estimates could go as high as $2 trillion, which would make it one of the largest tax hikes ever passed.
Yeah, the interesting part about this is not only does the federal government stand to get a cut of all these emissions permits being traded and hence this revenue, the regulatory impact of forcing industries to make decisions, ones that may not be able to purchase permits, ones that may have to purchase permits and pass the cost along to consumers, ones that may have to lay off employees or disappoint middle-class shareholders just to stay afloat and keep making enough earnings to employ the people they have. Those are all tough decisions that may not be reflected in that $645 billion of tax revenue. So the costs here on the economy as a whole are not only fiscal, as imposed by the government, but regulatory, as imposed by the government. And as time goes on, those costs are going to go up exponentially. The $646 billion is over a 10-year period that starts out over the first few years raising practically nothing. By the end of that period, you're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars per year. Hence that very high-level cost estimate that Natasha cited. That's almost certain to come true as we get out beyond that 10-year window.
And this will mean higher bills for gasoline, utilities, and basically every consumer product. So even though, you might be thinking, well, how is this going to affect me as a taxpayer? We're just talking about these big energy companies, but ultimately those costs will be borne by consumers.
And one of the big problems here is that this debate is not actually happening in a fiscal vacuum. Supporters of cap and trade say, well, society can afford the regulatory costs, taxpayers can afford the additional revenues that will be taken from their pockets and from businesses through all this trading. But the problem is there are other issues, fiscally facing the nation. For example, the pending bankruptcy of Medicare that will go completely broke in the year 2017 and will either have to be seriously restructured or, as many congressional Democrats would prefer, taxes will be raised to bail that program out. You have Social Security coming down the line. You have the Obama administration's health care plan and tax increases associated with that. When you combine these burdens, you're talking about something that is utterly unsustainable, which is why cap and trade is just one of the worries we have, and environmentalists out there need to understand their cause is not the only one competing for tax dollars.
NTU has joined with a fellow free market think tank, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, in a campaign to help stop this massive bill from going through. You can visit NTU's website, ntu.org, and sign up for our Taxpayer Action Center. There you'll be able to send a letter to your representative urging him or her to vote against this bill when it eventually comes to the floor.
It's vitally important that you understand by eventually we mean perhaps within the next few days after Congress returns to session. There will be a big battle, obviously, in the Senate. There are many Democrats opposed to this bill. There are some Republicans in favor. So there are a lot of interesting personalities in play here who might be swayed one way or another. Whatever happens, it's going to be a heck of a fight, and taxpayers need to be involved in it. Again, the address for further information, www.ntu.org. And in this segment of Speaking of Taxpayers here on Gimme Radio, sponsored by the 362,000-member National Taxpayers Union, one of your favorite, if not indigestion-causing segments, Outrage of the Week. Have you ever heard of that principle, pay it forward? It's a maxim that came about during the 1990s, and it's sort of the process whereby if you do good for another person you don't even know, that goodness will come back to you someday from some other person. It's kind of the way we ought to be treating each other. Well, pay it forward in the case of the federal government seems to mean pay people first, ask questions later. And that's certainly not a maxim we want our government to live by. According to an annual report from Congress's Government Accountability Office, federal agencies doled out $72 billion with a B dollars last year in, quote, improper payments to contractors, individuals, and other entities. Now, improper payments are classified as excessive disbursements, duplicate transactions, money that went to unqualified recipients, and in a few cases, even underpayments of individuals. But largely, this is a case of money being spent that should never have been spent. Now, since about 2005 or so, the Improper Payments Information Act has required federal agencies to identify these wrong payments, tell Congress what they're going to do to rectify them, and hopefully put in place a strategy that will keep them from happening again. Unfortunately, not all federal agencies met the deadlines to report their improper payments. Big surprise there. And so what we're getting is a phenomenon whereby the amount being reported is increasing, not necessarily because the payments themselves are getting worse, but because more agencies are simply able to report that weren't able to do so before. Such is the case with this $72 billion. This is a 45% increase from 2007. Part of it from programs audited for the first time, the other part due to revised estimates from some components of the Medicaid program. So in real terms, the increase of 45% was more like 25% if you want to count existing agencies that had been audited and are revising their estimates upward. Here's some interesting examples of that $72 billion, what they comprise. $12.1 billion went to waste from the Earned Income Tax Credit. That's the program that sends checks to those who have few or no tax liabilities. It's really just a welfare program. That represents 1 out of every $4 spent on the program, folks. 1 in $4 is being dispersed improperly under the Earned Income Tax Credit. Take a look at the unemployment insurance. The unemployment payment rate for errors hovered at 10%. There are a lot smaller programs, money-wise, but their error rate is much higher. Look at the National School Breakfast Program, 25% improper payment rate, just like the Earned Income Credit, a 1 in $4 screw-up. Take a look at, for example, the State Children's Health Insurance Program, almost 15% of improper payments. That, of course, was the program that got a huge funding boost earlier this year, along with a new tax increase on tobacco products. Well, there again, we're rewarding a program that has a history of inaccurate disbursements. Not the smart thing to do. So many agencies may be reporting fewer mistakes in 2008 versus 2007. Others are just being audited for the first time, but you know, the news won't get any better. There are still 10 major programs that have not reported their improper payments. What will that hold? Will the $72 billion figure climb towards, say, $100 billion? Time will tell. Hopefully a year from now, we'll have better news to report. Well, folks, we sure hate to keep agitating you on this show, but unfortunately, this is sometimes what we need to do to make sure taxpayers get into the fight and oppose this government waste. One way to do that is to attend our National Taxpayers Conference here in the Washington, D.C. area, to be held in just a few short weeks, Natasha.
That's right, Pete. National Taxpayers Conference 2009 will take place June 11th through 13th, just outside the nation's capital in Crystal City, Virginia. There, you'll be able to network with other taxpayer activists, attend breakout sessions on everything from how to fight property taxes to new media resources to fundraising and a host of other issues. You'll also hear from speakers, including members of Congress, including former presidential candidate Senator John McCain. And the most recent addition to our roster is the chairman and CEO of Overstock.com, Patrick Byrne.
Yes, and many of you may be asking, who in the world is this guy Byrne? Well, Overstock.com is one of the nation's largest online clearinghouses for folks who want to go shopping for overstocks, as the name implies. This is an online-only outlet, just like Amazon.com tends to be. And Mr. Byrne has a very capitalistic view, a very pro-taxpayer view of how e-commerce should be conducted without so much interference or levels of taxation by government. He will be a very interesting and very entertaining speaker. He's also been behind a number of ballot measures. There was a round of them several years ago. He was advocating that would have required schools to devote a certain percentage of their budgets to classroom instruction only. They couldn't squander it on things like administrative overhead. Unfortunately, not many of those concepts took hold, but he was in the fight, he threw his hat in there, and he fought the good fight. That's the important part to remember. You won't win every time, but you won't know how good you are at what you do unless you get in the ring and try it.
You can get all the information about our conference, including hotel details, as well as register on our website. That's www.ntu.org. Hurry up and register soon as space is filling up. Again, that's ntu.org.
That about wraps it up for this edition of Speaking of Taxpayers, sponsored by the National Taxpayers Union for Gimme Radio. We hope you enjoyed this installment. And remember, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power. And we speak truth to power every week here on